May 10, 1869. Promontory Summit, Utah. Two locomotives faced each other across one length of rail. The continent had been crossed. 6 years, 1,776 miles of track, thousands dead, cost so staggering Congress would investigate for 40 years. The final spike was gold, ceremonial, useless. The real work had been done with iron spikes, millions of them, driven by hands that froze in Sierra winters and blistered in Nevada summers. Before 1863, where crossing the continent meant months by wagon or ship around Cape Horn, the nation had vast territories it couldn't govern. California might as well have been another country. Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. The nation was fracturing over slavery. A railroad wouldn't solve that, but it might prevent Western territories from drifting away. The act chartered 2 private companies, Union Pacific Building west from Omaha, Central Pacific Building east from Sacramento. All incentives, 6,400 acres per mile, plus government bonds worth $16,000 per mile on flat ground, $48,000 in mountains. The bonds were loans, technically. The land grants were permanent. Companies could profit from the continent without running a profitable railroad. Central Pacific started first, January 1863. Union Pacific waited until July 1865. That head start should have given Central Pacific an advantage. It didn't. Central Pacific had to cross the Sierra Nevada, a granite wall rising 7,000 feet. A Union Pacific had the Great Plains, flat for 600 miles. Geography favored Union Pacific. The race became which company could overcome disadvantages faster. Theodore Judah surveyed the Sierra route in the 1850s. Grades would exceed 2%, steep but manageable. 15 tunnels would be necessary, nearly 2 miles through granite. 4 California businessmen, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, put up capital. They knew nothing about railroads. Stanford was a grocer. They saw profit from subsidies and land grants. Judah died in 1863, before construction began. The Big Four took control. They hired engineers and labor contractors. Labor was the first problem. White workers demanded high wages and quit frequently. Charles Crocker proposed hiring Chinese laborers. The idea met resistance. Chinese workers were considered too small, too weak. Crocker hired 50 in 1865. They worked faster than white crews. Within 2 years, an over 12,000 Chinese workers comprised 90% of the workforce. They were paid less, $30 versus $40, and did the most dangerous work. The Sierra tunnels consumed 1865 and 1866. Summit Tunnel sat at 7,000 feet. Crews blasted through granite with black powder and nitroglycerin. The tunnel was 1,659 feet long. It took 15 months. Workers died in accidents, collapses, and falls. The exact number wasn't recorded. Winter work above 6,000 feet was nearly impossible. Snow accumulated over 40 feet. Avalanches killed dozens to over 100 in winter, 1866 to 1867. Workers lived in tunnels dug into snowbanks, blasting granite they couldn't see for months. Union Pacific was run by Thomas Durant, who created Crédit Mobilier to build the railroad at inflated costs. Durant owned both companies. The scheme was legal, but spectacular self-dealing. Durant hired Grenville Dodge, former Union general. Dodge understood speed over perfection. Union Pacific's strategy was volume. Lay track fast to claim subsidies. Flat ground meant minimal grading. Crews laid a mile per day routinely, 2 on exceptional days. Union Pacific labor came from Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. Wages were $3 per day, but conditions were brutal. Workers lived in mobile camps, hell-on-wheels towns of tents, saloons, gambling, brothels. Violence and disease, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, killed regularly. Workers too sick were left behind. Native American resistance complicated construction. The railroad crossed Sioux, Cheyenne, or Pawnee territories without treaties. Tribes attacked crews, derailed trains, tore up track. The attacks were strategic. Slow construction, make it too costly. Union Pacific hired guards and requested military protection. Cavalry units protected crews. Skirmishes throughout 1867 to 1868. Hundreds died both sides. By late 1867, both railroads had crossed major obstacles. Central Pacific finished Sierra tunnels. Union Pacific reached the Rockies. The race accelerated, and the act hadn't specified where lines would meet. Each mile meant more subsidies. Railroads laid parallel lines, claiming both were official routes. Congress intervened in 1869, designating Promontory Summit. Final months were feverish. Union Pacific set a record April 28, 1869, 10 miles in 12 hours. Over 4,000 workers participated. The 10 miles cost $40,000 to $60,000, less than $80,000 in subsidies. Central Pacific attempted to match, but failed. Their Chinese workers had worked longer hours for years. Fatigue limited capacity, but May 10th brought dignitaries and photographers. Stanford would drive the Golden Spike. The ceremony delayed when Durant's train was held by workers demanding back pay. At 12:47 p.m., Stanford swung and missed. He swung again, connected. Telegraph sent, "Done." Bells rang across the nation. The celebration obscured reality. The railroad was completed but barely functional. Grades too steep, curves too sharp, bridges temporary. Track gauge varied. Connecting required immediate repairs. Trains ran slowly with frequent derailments. The railroad needed years of rebuilding. The human cost was extraordinary. Exact deaths unknown. Contemporary estimates, 1,200 to 1,500. Modern historians believe 2,000 to 2,500, perhaps more. Workers died in accidents, collapses, falls, avalanches, disease, attacks, exposure. They died because trade and profit mattered more than safety. Financial cost was staggering. Federal government provided $61 million bonds, saw 20 million acres, larger than South Carolina. Railroads spent $100 million, $56,000 per mile. That included inflated Crédit Mobilier costs. Actual costs were half. The difference went to shareholders and corrupt officials. Railroads defaulted on loans. Taxpayers absorbed losses. The impact justified the cost. Before, crossing took months. After, 1 week by train. Freight costs dropped $200 to $40 per ton. California population doubled in the 1870s. The economy integrated. Time zones standardized for schedules. Telegraph followed railroad. The railroad accelerated Native American destruction. Buffalo herds hunted to near extinction. Military campaigns reached remote areas quickly. Settlers flooded territories, treaties broken, tribes forced onto reservations. The railroad made policy devastatingly effective. The Big Four became enormously wealthy. $20 million each, over $500 million today. Stanford founded Stanford University. Their wealth came from subsidies and manipulation, not profitable operations. Credit Mobilier scandal exploded in 1872. Vice President Colfax and politicians were implicated. Some lost careers. None went to prison. The railroad had been built to enrich investors through public funds. Yet the railroad remained. It couldn't be unbuilt. The continent stayed connected. The railroad became essential despite corrupt origins. Something built for wrong reasons could serve right purposes. The railroad changed how Americans thought about distance. Before, the continent was unknowable. After, irreversible in a week. That psychological shift mattered. The railroad made the nation feel unified. It created shared infrastructure, shared destiny. Built by private companies for profit, it became public asset reshaping the country. The 6 years from 1863 to 1869 represented peak 19th century industrial capacity. Results were imperfect, methods brutal, motivations corrupt. But achievement undeniable. 1,776 miles connecting ocean to ocean, binding a fractured nation with iron and wood. And the railroad wasn't the best possible. It was the one that got built. Perfect planning would have delayed decades. The country needed connection immediately. The flawed railroad served its purpose. It could be improved later. It was. But it had to exist first. Workers who died, Chinese in tunnels, Irish on planes, Native Americans defending, didn't see completion. They weren't invited to the ceremony. The spike was driven by executives who never laid rail. And that exclusion reflected the era. Capital mattered more than labor. The legacy is complicated. It enabled growth, settlement, integration. It facilitated genocide, exploited labor, enriched corruption. Both are true. The railroad didn't solve all problems. It created new ones while addressing old ones. That's typical for major infrastructure. By 1900, the railroad had been rebuilt entirely. Wooden bridges became iron. Grades reduced. Curves eased. Yet the 1869 railroad was unrecognizable 30 years later. But it had existed. It demonstrated crossing by rail was possible. First, you build something that works, then something that works well. The map changed May 10, 1869. Not just literally, new lines, towns, territories, but conceptually. Americans stopped thinking of separate regions connected by empty space. They thought of continuous whole, connected by infrastructure, traversable by anyone with a ticket. And the railroad didn't create that alone, but it made it visible, tangible, undeniable. 6 years, 1,776 miles, thousands dead, millions spent. One continent connected. The railroad was built faster, cheaper, more corruptly than expected. It was also more transformative. Problems solved were bigger than problems created. The nation it helped build was more integrated than the nation that authorized construction. As the railroad changed America's map, not just by adding lines, but by changing what the map meant, from separate territories to unified nation.